At 9:47 a.m., everything still looks normal on the surface. Emails are flowing, coffee is still warm, and nothing feels urgent yet. Then a small notification appears and the tone of the day quietly shifts. You might assume it is just another routine meeting invite. Kian thought the same thing for about 3 seconds. Then his stomach drops without any clear reason or data to justify it. He continues the meeting as if nothing is happening. But in his head, different scenarios begin to stack and compound. Risk is not confirmed yet, but it is already being priced in mentally. At 10:02, he joins the next call with a neutral face. By 10:14, the role is gone just like that. 3 minutes later, even his access quietly disappears. This is not a rare edge case in modern work systems. It is part of how volatility shows up in real-life employment. Here, we break down what actually happens after those 27 minutes are over. Kian is not a failure. He is a software engineer earning $140,000 a year. On paper, his long-term trajectory looks stable with low volatility. He has a house, a family, and 2 kids. There is also about $9,000 in savings sitting quietly. It feels like a buffer, but the time horizon is shorter than it appears. Their monthly expenses are close to $7,800. That means the savings covers just over 1 month of drawdown. This is not a safety net, it is a very thin margin. This part is rarely discussed in public. The risk is not just losing the job itself. The real issue is how fast the financial structure begins to break down. Expenses do not pause when income disappears. Bills continue to arrive on the same schedule. Without income, the cash flow imbalance becomes immediately visible. Many people believe they have a buffer. In reality, they have a very limited time window, and that window is already compounding in reverse. At this point, the brain starts searching for fast solutions. Under pressure, decision-making often shifts toward short-term relief, and those solutions tend to increase long-term risk. But there is something even more difficult than the money itself. It is the structure of the job market. Because recovery is not only about effort, but also timing and demand cycles. The unemployment rate looks stable at around 4%. On paper, that suggests a healthy labor market with low volatility. But numbers like this often hide what is actually changing underneath. The real shift is not layoffs, but hiring activity slowing down. Fewer openings reduce opportunity over any time horizon. It creates a quiet form of risk that is easy to miss. Companies are not aggressively cutting jobs right now. They are simply choosing not to expand their teams. This reduces long-term entry points into the system. If you lose your job now, you enter a tighter market. The number of candidates grows while openings shrink. That imbalance increases competition and extends job search time. On average, it takes around 6 months to find a new role. But most savings only last for a much shorter time horizon. That gap is where financial pressure begins to compound. Kian starts applying to jobs every day. The number of applications grows, but responses remain limited. Over time, this creates a sense of invisible friction in the system. It is not always about skill or effort. Many applications are filtered before a human even sees them. The system optimizes for efficiency, not completeness. So the challenge is not just competition, it is also a system that lacks transparency. And that changes how risk is experienced in the modern job market. Kian finally checks his unemployment benefit. This is what people call a financial safety net. The number feels smaller than expected. He receives around $560 a week. Before this, he was making over $2,700. That gap introduces immediate income volatility. Now he lives on roughly 20% of his previous income. His expenses, however, remain mostly fixed. The drawdown begins to widen over time. Even that reduced income is still taxed. The number that reaches his account is even lower. This isn't full protection, it's partial cushioning against risk. The bigger constraint is time horizon. Benefits don't last forever. In some states, they end in under 6 months. The system creates a mismatch. Time runs out before stability returns, and people are forced to improvise under pressure. This is where stress starts to build. Decision quality often drops under pressure. Financial mistakes tend to cluster in this phase. Options become more limited over time. Every decision starts to feel urgent. That combination increases financial risk exposure. 2 days later, another email arrives. It is not about job applications or interviews. It is about healthcare coverage and what happens next. The company insurance plan quietly stops. There is no transition period that feels comfortable. Suddenly, healthcare becomes a personal expense. The numbers are not small. Monthly premiums can exceed $2,000. And that is just to manage risk, not eliminate it. At the same time, income has stopped. But expenses do not follow the same pattern. In fact, some costs increase right when stability drops. Some people pause their insurance. Not because it makes sense mathematically, but because the short-term cash flow cannot support it. This is not a long-term strategy. It is a forced response to limited options. When volatility hits, flexibility disappears. Healthcare is rarely the headline in financial planning, but it carries significant long-term weight, especially during moments of income disruption. The pressure is no longer just financial. It starts to affect attention and decision-making, and that weight is harder to measure over time. Keon opens his 401k account and sees $185,000 sitting there. It looks like a safety net he can rely on. But in reality, it comes with hidden trade-offs. He considers withdrawing a portion to extend his runway. It feels like a logical short-term solution. Time feels more urgent than growth right now. But early withdrawal triggers taxes and penalties. The amount he actually receives is much lower. The visible number starts to shrink quickly. The money withdrawn today loses its future compounding power. It no longer participates in long-term growth. The impact is invisible but significant. Over a long time horizon, the loss can multiply several times. Not because of volatility, but because time was removed. Compounding works best when uninterrupted. Simple calculators rarely show this hidden cost. They focus on immediate numbers, not delayed outcomes. The biggest losses often appear later. Under pressure, people prioritize immediate survival. Long-term planning becomes secondary. This shift happens quietly during stress. Sometimes withdrawing is necessary in real situations, but the long-term cost is often underestimated, and that cost tends to be higher than expected. After a few weeks, the biggest change is not financial. It is how Keon starts to see himself over time. An identity drawdown is harder to recover than money. Daily structure quietly disappears without warning. Time feels slower when there is no clear objective. The time horizon stretches but feels heavier. He starts avoiding people he used to talk to. Not from anger, but from quiet self-doubt. Social exposure now feels like emotional risk. This is not a personal failure pattern. It is a common psychological response to sudden instability. Many people experience it without saying anything. Financial pressure slowly converts into mental pressure. That pressure begins to affect future decisions, and the cycle compounds quietly over time. Most systems only teach income growth. Very few explain the emotional volatility that follows loss. And that gap leaves people unprepared. Losing a job also removes structure from daily life. Work was not just income, but a time anchor. Without it, the day loses definition. At this stage, the problem is no longer singular. It becomes a mix of financial, emotional, and identity stress, and they arrive at the same time. Keon eventually finds a new job, but the salary is lower than before. The search takes months, stretching his time horizon further than expected. The recovery looks stable on the surface, but the drawdown already happened. His career trajectory shifts quietly in the background. The long-term curve is no longer as steep as before, and most people don't notice this kind of volatility until much later. The real loss isn't just missed income during unemployment. It's the break in momentum that compounds over time. That gap is harder to measure, but it shapes the long-term outcome. Compounding doesn't only work when things go well. It also amplifies setbacks when time is lost, and that makes recovery slower than expected. What's interesting is the solution isn't complex. It doesn't rely on perfect timing or high-risk strategies. It's built on small, repeatable actions over time. He starts rebuilding his emergency fund slowly. Small amounts, automated, consistent. It doesn't feel dramatic, but it reduces future volatility. The goal isn't fast growth or chasing returns. It's buying time when uncertainty appears. And time becomes the most valuable asset in volatile periods. In systems like this, income alone doesn't create stability. Distance from panic is what actually matters. And that distance is something you build over time. The real question is not if this will happen. It is when it enters your timeline without warning. And how prepared you are determines how much damage it creates. Some people panic when income stops suddenly. Others already built a small buffer of time. That difference was created long before the event itself. Small decisions during stable periods often feel irrelevant, but they quietly shape your downside when volatility appears. What looks insignificant now can define your future drawdown. If this changes how you see money, that shift matters, because awareness adjusts how you approach risk and time horizon. The rest is not theory, it becomes your decisions. If you want to understand this system more clearly, take it step by step. No noise, just patterns and numbers over time, because the next story might feel closer than expected.